What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. This is Revolutionary Review. We're going to go over the Daunte Wright killing, and we're going to see whether this was justified by the police or whether this was an unjustified murder that is very similar to different incidents we see played out throughout the U.S. It is a continuing occurrence and something that needs to be discussed. I'm going to make another video where I really break down the reasons for why police are continuously killing black people in the United States, but in this video I'm going to break down this particular incident, and I'm going to quickly go over why I believe it wasn't justified. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, he tried to run, he tried to resist, and that's something that I'm going to discuss in this video as well. Just understand that when I talk about these things, I'm not trying to justify criminality, I'm not trying to justify any sort of violent crimes, but at the same time, there is a dynamic here that is not being discussed, and that people, particularly white people, tend not to understand about these incidents. So I'm going to go over that. And just for a little backstory about myself, my name is Michael Soros, and I am an author. I'm a writer. I run this channel, Revolutionary Review. I have written the book, The Evolution of White Racism and Its Impact on Black Society in America. In this book, I talk about the different conditionings that white society has been placed upon or has been conditioned with to view black people as criminals. It basically is something that happened after slavery. You have the convict leasing system, which came in place in the late 1860s, early 1870s, and basically created the plantation prison system in the United States. So we see a progression from a system of slavery and slave catchers, whereas those that were acting as slave catchers and as jailers in the late 1800s were entirely focused on black people. So understand this. Jails and plantation prison system in the early 1890s, and I should say from the late 1860s to the basically early 1930s, you had a prison system that particularly was targeting black people. And after the 1870s, what you had was a system in which black people were being targeted to be pushed back into a system of slavery, what Douglas Blackman would refer to as slavery by another name. Now, I'm getting into a long-winded history that if you really want to understand, just read my book. Go pick it up on Amazon, The Evolution of White Racism, and you'll understand more where this kind of idea of black criminality comes from. And it's conditioned through popular culture, it's conditioned through the media, it's conditioned in every asset towards the white community and even towards the black community as well. They want to condition people to view black people as criminals, and they've done this for the past 200 years. Now, this has been changing in the past, I would say, 3 to 4 years. We've had a shift, and we're certainly seeing the media stop portraying blacks as criminals as much as they were. I think it's because people started to out them for it. It was something people started to realize it was happening. You had a lot of reports coming out, like the censorship frame report, like reports from different black activists, also authors like Cornel West, who basically would point out just the racism that existed within the Western media system in their targeting and their portrayal of black victims and also black assailants. Obviously, they would show black assailants, basically black suspects and black criminals, a lot more on TV than they would show black victims. And typically they would rather show a white victim than a black victim. And this was how the media portrayed things up until I would say 2015, right? So prior to 2015, the media was essentially targeting black people as to make them seem like criminals. They would create this censorship frame, and if you want to go look that up, the censorship frame written by Schneider, who is a social scientist. These are studies that came out that proved through different studies of the media that basically proven facts that they were showing you black people as criminals at exponential rates than they actually were committing crimes, and they were showing white victims at exponential time. Basically they wanted you to believe that all the people that were committing crimes were black and all the people that the crimes were being committed against were white. So this was a tool by the media to condition people to view black people as criminals, and that's what's played a big part in this shooting. And I would say maybe not like in this exact shooting, but in the kind of conditioning of white society to view black people as criminals and to fear that criminality as something that they need to defend against and generally shoot instead of ask questions or instead of acting in a civil manner. And when I say that, obviously this guy tried to run, so there is a bit of resistance there, and you can hear the cop scream, taser, taser, tase him, and then she accidentally shoots him and even says, "Oh crap, I shot him," and so I'll play it real quick for you guys so you guys can see what actually happened. And they're gonna go over.
Wright is seen stepping out of his vehicle.
So obviously they're trying to put him into custody.
After discovering he has an outstanding warrant,
and he basically freaks out, realizes, I don't want to go to jail.
And he gets back into the vehicle.
And here's the thing, okay?
As I watch the video and listen to the officers,
did you hear it? She's like, "Oh crap, I just shot him," right? Like, you see, basically,
Release footage begins minutes into
this lady cop pulls out her gun and she's like, "Tase him, tase him," but she has her gun in her hand. She's screaming, "Tase him," but she's sitting there with her gun in her hand, pointing at his, chest and emptying the clip. When there's no, this is the problem with this here, and this is the reason. Okay, yeah, he's resisting. Yeah, whatever, right? You can claim that maybe he tried to pull a gun, right? Or maybe he was going for a gun. That could have been the defense, and that's probably going to be the defense, that he was going for a gun. But when you see him in the car, you can clearly see that all he's trying to do is get away. He's trying to drive away. He's literally trying to shut the door. At one point you can see him reach for the door, trying to shut the door to drive away. So this guy is not trying to run, or not trying to fight. He's not trying to get a gun and shoot. He's trying to run away. He's trying to protect himself because he doesn't want to be another black person that gets arrested by the police and then they end up brutalizing him and stepping on his neck, and he ends up dead before he even reaches the booking. So this is the incident that you're going to have consistently brought up, is that why is it that when you see this happen, if this was a white person, I guarantee you they wouldn't have shot him. And I've seen dozens of incidents. I'm going to probably try to splice this video and throw in just a clip of one in particular, which is a white person that pulls a gun on a cop and the cop doesn't even shoot him. He basically just, ends up arresting him. And if that was a black guy, he would have killed him. And that's just the fear level that is instilled within white society. And that's something that I talk about in my book, and it's something that I'm going to talk about here real quick. So the big thing that I'm going to say is that if they were so worried about a warrant, like, there was no threat to the cops at this point. There was no gun. He had no deadly threat. So to use force, to use, sure, he's trying to run, and I get that you want to stop him because he has a warrant. Maybe he's going to hurt other people. But honestly, like, the warrant, you have his address, you know where he lives. You can go serve the warrant at his address. You can go find him. You don't need to go in some high-speed chase and risk other civilians' lives. You don't need to shoot at him and risk other people's lives by, or killing him just because he fears for his life. When you're surrounded by cops, like, you have like 4 or 5 cops stop him here and put him into, start putting him into custody and are like, all right, we're going to take you in. It's just an incident in which black people are inherently in fear of police. It's just something ever since the 1960s, when the Black Panthers had resisted, in the early 70s and late 60s, the Panthers would protect their communities because the police would essentially come into these communities and just brutalize people, and they would do it without any sort of resistance. And this allowed them to control these communities and to basically do anything they wanted to black people without having to worry about resistance. And that's what created the Black Panther movement, and that's what created the kind of Black Power movement, which gave black people the pride and the ability to fight back against a powerful, police system that was inherently built to oppress them. And this is something that people don't really understand, that the history of the prison system in the United States is built off of slavery, and it's built to target the minority communities, particularly black people. And it is because of this history of conditioning this black criminality, or this idea that ever since slavery, blacks are inherently criminals, because when they were slaves, they would steal, and they would have to do things against the kind of master's orders, and this led them towards a kind of a what they would call black pathology of criminality, which is something that in the 1960s people like the Moynahanian, these Patrick Moynihan apologists, or guys that would basically, these conservative rhetoricians would put forth these different psychological arguments for why the black community was suffering from poverty and criminality and all of these terrible things. But what they don't talk about, and what the Kerner Commission talks about, if you want to go really understand what was going on in the 1960s in black communities, was that it was actually white society that had forced black people into these ghettos through a system of white flight. They had fled these communities, forced these people into the ghettos, and then they essentially took all of their political and economic ties out of those communities and left these communities to suffer from massive socioeconomic depression through loss of jobs, because all the jobs fled with the white people into the suburbs and out of the ghettos. As black people started to become the majority in these communities, white people basically took all of the resources out of them, and the politicians then redrew many different lines through things called gerrymandering, in which they would then draw political zones to better benefit the suburban areas, which in many cases would become sundown towns that would restrict black access to these communities, and creating kind of these white suburban hubs that would then become the economic centers that were previously in places like Detroit, like Gary, Indiana, like Ferguson. These are places that we see in the news all the time now, but we don't realize the reality of what's happened in the history of these places and how these people have been affected by this history. And this is why you need to really understand the past in order to understand the present. You can't just look at what's happening and go, oh, well, it's crazy how many black people are criminals and how many gangsters are running around shooting people. We need to fear for our lives, and we need to shoot every black person that tries to resist us or tries to, defend their own life or their own vehicle or whatever it is, right? It's just something to consider, right? So I'm going to make another video where I really break down my view of the prison industrial complex in the United States, of the police system, of how policing is laid out, where it's basically targeted. So what you need to understand too is that a lot of times the reason why there's so many shootings in black communities is because black communities are the targets of policing. So most of the policing goes towards these communities because obviously they are considered high crime areas, and in fact they are. And when I say this, I'm not trying to justify criminals. Obviously any murderers, rapists, even armed robbers should probably go to jail. They should probably have whatever happens to them is probably justified, and that's fine. But what we need to understand is that in many cases these things are tiny little non-violent instances that lead towards a life of criminality or a life of police persecution from tiny little instances, even traffic violations, all kinds of things. But as soon as a black person has a criminal record, they're immediately looked at like a huge criminal, and then they need to be feared, and they need to be tased or shot if they don't fully cooperate with police. And that's something that is crazy when you start to look at a lot of what happens within the white community when police do a similar incident, or like I said, when police pull up on a white person, and a white person pulls a gun on them, and then they don't even get shot. That's crazy, right? And you can say, well, those police had a better training or whatever, but this is a continued recurrence. And obviously when we talk about how a lot of these different killings happen, we talk about how almost in every case it is police that are being targeted by the media as being justified. So we'll see what happens. We'll see kind of how this plays out, but for the most part I think that this wasn't really justified, and I don't really, I'm not really for the argument that police should be able to just, do what they want. Like I said, they could have let this guy go after he tried to drive away and just been like, you know what, we're just going to go to your house and we're just going to arrest you at your house. And if they want to charge you with evading arrest or whatever, then that's fine. But you don't need to kill the guy just because you didn't know you had your gun in your hand rather than your taser, because you were fearing for this guy pulling a gun on you or something, right? Like I said, if there was no fear for your life, if he didn't have a weapon, why shoot him? If you have a warrant for him, you know where he lives. You can go and arrest him at his house, and you don't need to kill anybody. You don't need to shoot shots, randomly in the streets. You don't need to, I don't know, chase him down. Like, whatever it is, this could have been all prevented by just a little less, aggression by the police. And this is the thing, like, police are very aggressive. They're taught to be aggressive because they need to take down, there's so many criminals that are doing so many bad things, and this is understandable. But what we need to understand is that in many cases, the socioeconomic conditions in many of these communities force a lot of these people into the lifestyle that they live. And it's not something that, I'm trying to justify or glorify. All I'm trying to say is that this needs to be understood. And it's like the Kerner Commission said in the 1960s. They said, what white people will never understand, but what black people can never forget, is that white people are deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white people condone it. And this is what was said in the late 1960s and 70s, is that we would be leading towards a massive civil unrest. We would be leading towards a civil war in the United States if we did not address the socioeconomic conditions in the ghettos and what is happening between the black community and the police community, and also the kind of conservative white community, and how they're kind of targeting each other with rhetoric and trying to justify massive funding of the police, massive militarization of the police, massive amounts of spending on surveillance systems, on the police state, trying to build this system that gets justified by the criminal kind of, like what was happening in the 1990s is you had this huge push towards creating a police state. And this was done by Bill Clinton basically through his passing of the crime bill, and this allowed an exponential rise in prison sentencing, in minimum, obviously 3-strike laws, and a wide range of high, very, very targeted laws and changes in policy that basically exploded the prison population in the United States. And it's something that has kind of gone down in recent years, but it is starting to, especially with the pandemic, it's starting to creep back up, and we're starting to see a rise again of the prison population in the United States, and kind of the reinstation of the prison industrial complex through private prison systems, which, when you understand where a lot of these people come from, when you are put into a lot of these juvenile facilities, because a lot of people in these communities end up, they're very poor, so they end up having to do things to try and survive, whether it's stealing a loaf of bread or going and hustling a nickel bag in the park or something so you can eat that night. That is something that creates this system in which then they get pushed into juvie, or they get arrested on some minor, and they go to these kind of youth detention centers, which many judges have even referred to as gladiator schools, in which they become trained and hardened criminals through these institutions that are basically run by gangs and by the criminals themselves, rather than the guards, who are very, very few and far between, and are very underfunded. And it's because the private prison system is trying to make money off of this system rather than actually rehabilitating people. So when these youth end up going into these correctional facilities, they end up being trained criminals. And this is what we need to understand, is that this is the legacy that is leading towards this police killing and this kind of recurring incidences because of this system and the way it kind of disadvantages a certain group that have to live a certain lifestyle in order to survive, and I know many people will say, well, you don't have to live that lifestyle, you could do this and you'd be fine, but you don't understand that. Like, you don't live in these people's lives, you don't understand these communities, and you don't understand how poor a lot of these communities are, and how a lot of these people, they have no choice. Like, they have to, in order to survive, they have to commit crime. And that's, it's something that even in the 1960s the Kerner Commission was putting out this warning that this is not their fault. This is the fault of the system that was created through the past 60 years, the system of segregation, the system of basically creating sundown towns, creating suburban communities that took all of the resources out of these economic communities in the ghetto and that left them basically on life support. Research the town of Gary, Indiana. Gary, Indiana is the perfect example of how white people, or I should say white society, has basically taken all of the resources out of a community and left it to collapse and crumble. And that's what happened in Gary, and that's what happened in Detroit, and it's what happened in Ferguson. It's what happened throughout the United States, in dozens and dozens of post-industrial cities that are now struggling to survive. Deindustrialization basically destroyed these communities in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and the loss of many of these factory jobs is what has led towards the large numbers of unemployed and or what they refer to as underemployed within these communities, because many people, even when they are employed, they're employed in very, very low wage jobs, and many times they can barely survive, let alone start to build some wealth to get out of their situation. And this is in many cases, this is the reality. So when the police are targeting these people, they're just targeting them, and it's like, oh, it's just another black person. We're not going to take into consideration anything about what he had to do to get to the place that he is now, and we're not going to take into consideration his previous interactions with police and how maybe he has been brutalized by police in the past, and that's why he fears for his life and doesn't want to actually be arrested with 4 cops around him who might end up brutalizing him once they put the cuffs on him. You don't know. So obviously you could say, well, the police are justified because he tried to run, so he's a criminal. Why would he try to run? He must be a criminal. So you can look at it however you want. Like I said, my opinion is that they're not justified in killing somebody that has no actual deadly threat towards them. He had no gun. He had brandished no knife. He just tried to get back in his car and leave because he feared for his life. And this is something we see again and again. But anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully it kind of shed some light on these incidences and why they happen, and let's talk about kind of how we can change this, or how we can at least address these issues. Like I said, if you want to pick up a copy of my book, The Evolution of White Racism, you'll get a better understanding of how historically blacks have been criminalized and blacks have been conditioned to, well, I should say white society has been conditioned to view blacks as criminals, and this creates this level of fear in which police then react in the way they do. Or even community, like what happened with George Zimmerman killing Trayvon Martin, right, with a pack of Skittles. He was like, oh, I thought he had a gun. Well, he had a pack of Skittles. It's because they've been conditioned to this way of looking at black people, right, to fear them rather than to try to have compassion and understand them, right? Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. If you want to pick up a copy of my book, check out Amazon.com, The Evolution of White Racism. Other than that, feel free to leave some comments in the sections below. Let's talk about this. Let's try to get some dialogue going. And obviously, if you guys think that the cops are justified, explain your reasons. If you think that they weren't, then yeah, let me know below. Thanks for watching, guys. Feel free to like and subscribe. Should be back at you with another video and talk about some more of these incidences and how we can better understand them and yeah, go forward. All right. Anyway, thanks, guys. Have a good one.